Metagame is open, but the release of Cull Obsidian has pushed Thanos back into the top spot, so let's take a look at the best decks in Marvel Snap. Cull Thanos has been by far my most successful deck. I have about a 60% win rate with it over about 60 games, going plus 50 cubes over those 60 games. Obviously, that is pretty damn good. This has been easily the best deck for me in the entire game. I will say that it's not the best deck by a vast margin, but I do think it is clearly number one right now, post-release of Cull Obsidian. Now, Cull Obsidian is only, I would say, very much required in this. This is really the only thing that is going to be like, oh man, I'm so sad I didn't get Cull Obsidian for this. This is the big one, and I think without Cull Obsidian, the deck does sort of fall back into the pack alongside other decks that are pretty good right now. With Cull Obsidian, I think it is clearly in front, even if not by much. And being clearly in front is relevant. I think this is the best deck in the game. It's been a while since I think I could definitively say that. And I think that the fact that Thanos allows you to be a deck that is built like a combo deck, it snaps like a combo deck, but actually plays like a mid-range deck, this deck is kind of just the everything deck. It does whatever it is that you want to do in most every single matchup. It has vast amounts of stats. It even gets to play Shang-Chi. It has maneuverability. It has location control. It has energy cheating. It has everything you need in a good deck in Marvel Snap. It even has disruption in the form of Kyera, protecting your stuff against Shang-Chi. This is, in my humble opinion, the deck I would play if I were someone who was looking for a very fast climb, or just maybe the optimal climb, the optimal choice for Infinite right now. Now, I will say, it doesn't have to be this exact 12 cards. You can, make some swaps around. Like, I've seen people saying, oh, well, I'll play Leech instead of Jeff so I can beat the Hela gamers. And it's like, yeah, go ahead, you can do that. But really, the thing is that this shell is what matters. You can swap Shang-Chi out for another tech card, Enchantress if you want. I wouldn't do it. Obviously, I like this build, but there are swaps you can make. And you should focus when you make those swaps on cards that are going to win you large amounts of cubes, which are cards that your opponents are not going to play around. And that will be a running theme when discussing the flex slots in any deck in this video. Hela is next up, and I think Hela is a very, very good deck right now, which of course raises many questions like, is this the kind of deck we want to be one of the best decks in the game? Is this actually a good thing? What does it mean that 2 Lockjaw decks are very clearly 2 of the 4 best decks in the game right now, kind of at a minimum? I think if you really put me to the question, I would say that the 2 Lockjaw decks are probably the 2 best decks in the game right now, maybe. And I think that is, as a longtime Lockjaw Vendetta haver, I feel a little justified right now. But I will say that I think Hela is a beatable deck. It is something you can mitigate the losses from and maximize your gains from. And I think a lot of the bad feelings around Hela, including my own bad feelings, are bad feelings that are related to it feels like the game is out of your control on turn 6. And the way to alleviate those bad feelings is by saying, it's okay to leave. It is absolutely okay to leave these games and not get juiced for a bunch of extra cubes. You can do that, and we need to normalize it. Stay against Hela when you're actually going to win. The rest of the time, 1 cube, that's fine. And the good thing about Hela is it tells you what it is very early in the game, whether that be from a discarded Black Cat or playing a turn 3 Lady Sif or playing a Blade. You kind of have an idea of what they're doing very early, which makes it hard for them to get a lot of snap value on you, because you can reasonably look at the situation and say, okay, if they discard some cards and play a Hela, can I win? And if the answer is no, you have to leave. So please make sure when you play against this deck, you are respecting it. Pay her due respect. Anni Bounce is probably one of the decks that I see the absolute most. And while it is, I would say, pretty significantly worse than it was before the Beast nerf, it is a deck that a lot of high-end players are very comfortable on. And it's a deck that I think, when you draw the right cards, matches up pretty damn well into Thanos. And those 2 qualities are a very good way to get a lot of people at the high end of Infinite playing a specific deck. The way it matches up well into Thanos is pretty much when you do the Annihilus stuff. You have a Sentry, you have a Hood, you Annihilus stuff over there, you clog their Lockjaw lane. That stuff's really damn good when you can pull it off, and you can pull it off a decent amount of the time. You did lose some power with Beast, and that's something you're just going to have to live with, but really what you're doing here is the same as what you were always doing here. It's just worse, and that has been true of Anni Bounce basically ever since Anni Bounce existed. We have lost 3 energy Werewolf, we have lost Perma Beast, we have lost a point of power on Annihilus and the ability to send over zeros, but we're still chugging along. And I think that is a fine thing to do. I do think this is one of the better decks in the game. I would recommend it if you are familiar with the playstyle, but I will give a pretty heavy warning that this deck, I genuinely do believe, is quite difficult to play with. It will make your brain hurt, and if you're not on, you can make a bunch of small suboptimal plays that snowball into losing 1 games with this deck, probably easier than with any other deck. I think this is the deck that makes my head hurt the absolute most when I play it in the entire game of Marvel Snap. It is quite difficult to deal with. Now, let's talk about Cull Obsidian. I do think Cull Obsidian does a little bit towards simplifying your game plan, which is good because this deck is hard to play, but if you do not have Cull Obsidian, you can absolutely replace him with Enchantress. And again, we're going to be talking about the flex spots in the deck. You're going to be focusing on cards that can juice your opponent for cubes that may not be expected. For example, you have a choice between Iceman and Spider-Ham. You can make whatever choice you feel like you want to make there. You have a choice between Enchantress and Cull Obsidian, and you can make whatever choice you feel like you want to make there. Making either of those choices differently from me will not make this deck unplayable. It will not make it fall out of my recommended lists. Destroy remains a competent and functional deck, and I would even go so far as to say this is a pretty good deck. I'm doing this in relative order. I feel like it's not like the order is a hard and fast order, but going from my gut right now, this is where I would have Destroy. I think it is an actual deck. It's a solid, reasonable deck that a lot of people can play competently, and it's a good recommendation to the people that are watching this video for the purposes of finding a deck to close those last few ranks to infinite or climbing from wherever you are. I do think that the major thing that's going to determine your Destroy success is just your luck when playing it. I understand that is like kind of obvious to say, but Destroy, more than most other decks, really does rely on you being able to capitalize on your draws that are actually good and on the 1 or 2 flex spots that you have really surprising your opponent. So when we talk about those flex spots, there's really one, if we're going to be real about it, and it is the spot I have Arnim Zola in. But there are probably 5 cards you can run in there. You can run Eliath, you can run Taskmaster, you can run Shang-Chi, you can run Lady Deathstrike. You can pretty much run whatever card you're really interested in running in there. I'm not going to argue with it unless it's like really stupid. As long as it makes sense here, you could probably do it. You know what I mean? And that 12th card is going to be the Cube Juicer. This card's role is to be an unexpected piece of tech that you have the ability to snap aggressively when using, and your opponent does not expect it. And so for that reason, there are a variety of cards that can fill that role. The whole point of it is that this deck is already more or less solved except for that slot. So what you want to do with that slot is maximize your cube gains. Now, as far as I was talking about luck, yeah, this deck really needs to draw the 1-drops and the right cards to blow them up early in the game. It's got to happen early. If you draw those late, this deck doesn't do much. You need to be doing stuff early in the game or your whole thing kind of falls apart because both Null and Death scale off of effectively the game actions you take early. This is a deck that needs to snowball early. And it's also a deck that is not overwhelmingly confidently snapping, even though it has to. It's sort of priced into these snaps before it necessarily knows what its opponent is doing. However, I believe the hot location is cloning Vats, so at least for one day, this might actually jump up to being the absolute best deck in the game, because cloning your Venoms and Carnages and Giant Deadpools and Free Deaths is really, really good. I think here is roughly where I would draw the delineation of moving into tier 2, and it feels bad to do that to my boy Loki. Just has consistently been one of my absolute favorite decks to play But right now, I do feel that while it is a successful deck that you can succeed with, obviously there are players at high elo who are very successful with the list, like Tanjo. I do think that right now it's a little bit harder for me to recommend, especially if I'm recommending it in a general context. Loki is good, and it's playable, but it's fine, right? Like, everyone kind of gets it at this point. I do want to address that my build is running Supergiant and Alioth, and those are my cube juicers. We are returning once again to this concept. You can replace them with other cards that juice cubes. Quake is a great one to do. Legion is a consistent one. Vision, things like that. You can do whatever you want with those slots. Just make sure you're getting unexpected cube equity out of them. That is the key to understanding how to add those extra cards in that you are missing if those cards are not absolutely 100% key to the deck's functionality. Sera is in a similar spot, and it was really Dara's build of Sera that got me thinking about the role of these cube juicing cards, because Sera is a deck that if you take this exact 12, I think everyone's going to know what you're doing and what your range is. But if you replace one of these cards with a Quake, a Legion, whatever, right? Like, you replace it with something that people are not expecting, your cube rate skyrockets as long as you approach that card correctly when you try to snap, having it or not having it. Sera remains a deck I feel pretty comfortable on. I do think that the addition of Cull allowing Thanos decks to just totally overload Shang-Chi does push me towards maybe considering something like Absorbing Man for the deck, because Cull is just so big and allows that deck to accelerate out so much big stuff. I feel like that matchup basically switched because of the release of Cull, and that is why Thanos is at the top right now and Sera no longer is. This was a matchup that I felt was pretty favorable for Sera, but between Cull allowing you to play a Scar early, overloading your lanes, the fact that they have Kyera, it does feel like the matchup has gotten legitimately worse, and when Thanos is rolling downhill, you are no longer going to be favored against it, and that is sort of putting the ball in Thanos' court because they're the ones who know if they're rolling downhill against you or not. This is still a deck that is absolutely competitive in the matchup. It's just like the matchup, I do think, went from significantly Sera favored to, I would say, reasonably Thanos favored. I feel a lot more confident as the Thanos player and a lot less confident as the Sera player. And before Cull came out, I was feeling like Sera was favored in that matchup even without Killmonger. So that should tell you just how big of a deal it is that the deck gets to really overload Shangs in that way. Doing something like Lockjaw into Stone plus Kyera, into like Cull plus Stone, into like Stone plus Scar is absolutely kind of unbeatable. There's just too much big stuff on the board. Sera doesn't have the stats to keep up. And even if you Shang-Chi one lane, you have to Shang-Chi the right lane, because if they flip up a Cull and your Shang-Chi pops up and you end up going for like the Shang-Chi on a Scar lane and they flip up a Kyera, and it's just like, oh my God. They kind of overload you now, and Cull is an important part of that. Now, in terms of explaining why Sera declined so precipitously, yes, Thanos becoming a better deck against it is a significant major change to how this deck's matchup spread works, but the primary driver is, of course, Hela. It is absolutely unbeatable. Hela is the deck that arose in response to the Sera meta. Sera was everywhere, it was killing all the combo decks, but it has a fundamental limit on the amount of points it can put out. This is the same limit that Thanos is actually trying to exploit. And Hela is able to exploit that with ruthless efficiency. There is very little that a Sera deck can reasonably put in the deck to actually interact with Hela. It's just they're going to do the Hela thing, and the Hela decks are extremely well built to make sure that Hela actually happens and make sure there's 2 or 3 things in the discard pile. And once that's happened, it's a points race, and Sera is just not a great points deck. You'll notice that there is a Lizard in here, there is a Maximus in here. Those are the points you're going to have to try to play against Hela with. And, you know, it's better than not running them, but it's not a reasonable proposition a lot of the time to actually beat a Hela with this deck, which has pushed it from being the best deck in the game to okay. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that She-Naut, and maybe if you throw Leech in Thanos, are the only actual playable Leech decks. I think most other decks playing Leech have this issue where their early game is so stop and start, where like if you get the Zabu and then you can start snowballing, then your Leech is good, but otherwise you're playing Leech from behind, and you just kind of can't play Leech from behind. And I think that's sort of an example of Leech's own failure as a safety valve, because we're in a metagame where Hela is a significant part of it, and there aren't good enough Leech decks for that to actually be a thing, outside of maybe this one. I think that this is probably the best Leech deck that exists that is like a dedicated Leech deck where Thanos is just like throwing it in there to try to beat Hela some of the time. I don't really think it's necessary there. It is necessary here because, as always, I've said this, I can't tell you how many times I've said this. This deck uses Hela. This deck uses Leech, both defensively and offensively. And generally, when you use a card for multiple roles, it ends up being a more serviceable card. This is not a deck that is running Leech to deal with a specific thing in the metagame. This is a deck that was already running Leech and then benefits from the metagame becoming more favorable to Leech, as opposed to Darkhawk, which is throwing Leech in there, forcing it into the deck, or Thanos, which is, again, forcing it into the deck. This is a deck that is ready-made for Leech, and so it is a more natural fit here. Next up is Lockdown, which is fine. For this week, during power couples, you can replace Medusa with Scarlet Witch. Obviously, she ends up being a 2/4 with Vision as a 5/9. That's pretty good. You end up making the power back up on the Vision, and having some extra location control is not a bad thing at all. However, I still have Medusa in here because I do expect that power couples is going to end while this video is still, in people's feeds. And so I don't want to be giving people advice like play Scarlet Witch after the power couples event ends. So we still have Medusa in here. That said, I think this deck is another deck that is fine, right? Like, it's a good deck, but it runs into some actual power issues. I will say, if you're looking for a deck that you can just pick up and play, I think this deck and She-Naut are about as good as it gets. And I think this is the kind of deck where your game plan is very face up. Your opponent kind of knows that, but because of the ability you have with cards like Jeff and Vision to move cards around, because of the final turn mind game of things like Dr. Doom and Alioth, you end up in situations where your game plan is face up, but they still have to guess which path you're going to take, which is beneficial to your cube rate. I think that is a kind of double-edged sword, though, because, there's usually a way for them to win the game. And that means that this deck is not operating on an extremely high power scale. It's very rarely like, 100% locked out unless you're Aliothing, and then if your opponent is smart, well, they're probably leaving. So you end up in these spots where when you have the 100%er, they're gone. And when you're in a lot of other situations, you're on a 50%er. And I do feel like this deck generates a lot of 50%ers. So while it is an easy deck to play, I won't pretend that it's the most, overwhelmingly tilt-free experience. Hey, you're a Darkhawk fanboy? This is the best you got right now. Darkhawk is in an awkward spot because even though Blob is still, nerfed, it's still a pretty good card against Darkhawk, and there's a lot of Thanos running around, and boy, those Thanoses love playing Blob, and boy, those Blobs seem to be protected by Kyera a lot, and boy, that really nullifies a lot of what this deck is trying to do. So you have this build, which I do think is superior to the Leech builds, because at least it is able to do stuff when at least its 5-drop is theoretically 16 power, or however you want to split the power between Annihilus and Sentry. At least it's got some numbers in it. And I think right now you need numbers to compete. You can't just be playing things like Leech and then be like, oh yeah, I'll beat Thanos with this. It's hard to do. You need numbers on the back end if you want to try to pull something like that off. So this is a deck that has a lot more numbers in it. It has the guaranteed win of Alioth some of the time. That's a solid thing to do. As always, the downfall to this kind of deck is there's kind of only one way to get rid of your stuff, so it ends up being very dependent on did you draw Annihilus. Annihilus is just the best card in this deck so much of the time, and if you don't draw him, you are just crying because you have some cards that are actually legitimately bad without him. Whereas the Annihilus bounce lists, you can get rid of that stuff with Beast, you can get rid of Hood with Falcon. It's a much more manageable downside in other lists compared to this one. I've got one honorable mention. I have not played this deck. I saw it on Untapped. I want it to be good so bad. And I know Black Swan quests are coming up, or, you know, they're already out by the time I'm recording this, and definitely by the time the video is out. I just wanted to get this out there. I saw this on Untapped. It had like a super high win rate, a super high cube rate, but a sample size of like 100 or something. And I just want to see if we could juice that sample size up because I want this to be good so damn bad. I'm like the biggest zoo truther on earth. I love zoo. I want it to be a thing, probably more than I want any other archetype to be a thing. And between this and the Dracula dump decks, I feel like something is probably there bubbling beneath the surface where it's like, this is almost a legitimate tier 2 deck. It's almost something, but I need to see more of it. So I'm going to throw this one out there. Of course, you could also be playing the Dracula dump decks, those destroyer decks that are using Dracula and Infinaut and Destroyer, alongside cards like Cosmo and Armor in a one-drop based shell with Black Swan. I almost put one of those on here as well. This one's more exciting to me, but I view them as sort of a similar archetype, completely honest with you. They're both zoo, in my humble opinion. So if you are someone who thinks you have a good list, I mean, let me know, because I really want this kind of deck to be good. I want this one to be good. I want the strong guy Dracula one to be good. This is the kind of deck I want to play so badly. And I'm putting it on here as an honorable mention in hopes that it can, you know, maybe someone who's just looking for a deck to mess around with will play this and will find out how good it actually is. So that is why this one is here. Yes, it has good numbers on Untapped, but this is more of a hopium pick than anything else. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it this far in the video. I, as always, have been KMBest. You, as always, have been phenomenal. Thank you so much. Remember to click like, subscribe, all of that stuff. I really appreciate it when people do that, and I am trying to grow a larger appreciation for the fact that I have an audience and the fact that that audience appreciates me. So thank you for being a KMBest enjoyer. As played out as that joke may be in terms of names on the ladder, it's not played out when I say it, because that's how that works. So thank you so much. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one.